It's good to be here. Spent many times in this area, particularly Chicago. I was really glad to see I even have a former student out there, Dr. Patel. Where's Dr. Patel? I saw him. There he is. He's hiding over there now. That's one of the great things about teaching, is that you end up with students all over the place. And now, especially being back in California again, I run into them all the time. In fact, I have 3 serving in the state legislature right now. In fact, I think your current State Commissioner of Education, Tony Smith, is also former students, so they're everywhere. So tonight I want to speak about education, as you can see, racial inequality, and the future of the democracy. A lot of us are thinking about the future of democracy right now, because it is primary that we're in. And given that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders could win the primaries of the respective parties in this state, it says a lot about where we are. Both how polarized we are, but how deeply entrenched the feelings of unease are right now across the country. And I think for good reason. There are many Americans, despite the recovering economy, who are not recovering, whose lives haven't improved, whose sense of the future is pretty bleak. And they're angry, they're upset, and searching for leadership, searching for answers, and so far our political system hasn't provided them. I want to talk about that in the context of education, even though education hasn't come up much in the campaign, which is a problem, because we have a bipartisan problem in education in America. Both parties have pursued similar strategies, and we haven't seen a whole lot of progress in education. And I was concerned when I heard that both unions, the NEA and the AFT, had endorsed Hillary Clinton very early because she never has said what she's going to do, and challenged Randy Weingarten, who's a friend, the president of the AFT, to ask, what are you getting in exchange for this endorsement? And so we're getting the first woman maybe elected president. I said, well, that's a good thing. I just hope we get some good policies too. So in the hope of really articulating what good policies might look like in the context of the big challenges facing the country, I want to address what many politicians talk about but never fully explain. And that is what it means to say that education is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Because lots of policymakers, from President Obama to Arne Duncan, who many of you are familiar with, to Joel Klein, and go on down the list of prominent individuals who like to say that education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century, but never explain what that means. Right? What's really at stake? And what are we doing to secure the rights of children whose rights right now in education are not secure? So let me take us back, though, and point out that we have historically, if we get these look to schools to solve many of our most complex and pressing challenges. All right, as a nation of immigrants, we have historically looked to schools to absorb immigrants, to integrate immigrants, whether they came from Europe or Asia or Africa or even Latin America. And we did that primarily by insisting that they give up their culture and give up their language. Because in America, the price of mobility has always been assimilation. Right? And for those Americans who made that bargain, it's one we expect future generations of immigrants to continue to make. Even though we now have very clear evidence that sometimes not assimilating is actually better for them, not giving up their home language. Right? And that shows up especially in health. Because it turns out that in many cases, recent immigrants, particularly those from Latin America and Mexico, have better health outcomes when they first come, despite poverty. And the longer they're here, the further behind they fall as they become American. But that's just one of the projects that we've attached to our schools. We've also attached the bigger job of breaking down apartheid in America, of ending the racial barriers that separated groups historically in this country. We looked to our schools to do it before we did other institutions. And this picture of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, where 9 students were being escorted to school by federal troops, and a Republican president sent them there to enforce the Brown decision, is a pointed reminder of what's at stake, or at least it was then. Because Eisenhower understood, as did several other presidents until 1980, that if you wanted to begin to integrate this country, you had to start by integrating the schools. And even in the face of mobs that wanted to fight to prevent it, whether that be in Little Rock or in Boston, because the truth was there was blood on the streets in Boston, and several prominent American politicians got their start throwing bricks at black children on their way to school in Boston. We understood that integrating our schools was key to creating a more equal society. And what's interesting about that, as our schools have become more segregated now over the last 30 years, and then interestingly, even as we commemorated the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision, there was no mention from the Obama administration on where we stood, right? On the fact that the country is now more segregated in terms of its schools than ever before. And segregated, and Chicago knows this well because you are as segregated as any city, not just on the basis of race, but on the basis of class. Because we typically concentrate the poorest, most disadvantaged kids, mostly of color, in under-resourced schools. And that's an American experience, for the most part. And what's interesting about that history is that we made our most progress in closing the gaps in achievement that we claim to be so concerned about when we were most committed to integration. That is, if you look at the record, that we were closing those gaps in reading and math and science and making the most progress in the 1970s up until the 1980s, when we were not only integrating schools, but we were also addressing the non-academic needs of kids, because we were engaged in a war on poverty. Well, we haven't been engaged in a war on poverty in a long time, and we haven't focused on integrating schools for even longer. And not surprisingly, we're not making much progress, despite the slogans and the rhetoric. And by now, we should know it takes more than a good slogan to make progress. No Child Left Behind was a good slogan, wasn't it? Except it didn't come from the Bush administration. It came from the Children's Defense Fund. And when Marian Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, "Leave no child behind," her intention was not merely to test kids as frequently as possible. She had something else in mind. The fact that there are many kids coming to school who have poor health, poor nutrition, and that in a wealthy nation we need to attend to all those things. Somehow that's not part of No Child Left Behind, and it's also not part of Every Child Succeeds, Every Student Succeeds, the new version of No Child Left Behind. And so even though the country is still this country has the highest child poverty rates of any nation right now, any advanced industrialized nation, we have the highest child poverty rates. It's largely an issue we don't talk about in education. And not surprisingly, the schools that are serving the most impoverished children are always the schools that are failing. And we fail to make the connections that poverty is actually an educational issue. Hungry kids don't do well in school. And we can't expect teachers to be social workers and psychologists and to address all the needs that come with poverty, because poverty is not just an economic issue, it's a psychological issue, it's an emotional issue. I have colleagues here that have been studying trauma rates in Chicago. There are children here in Chicago who have a higher incidence of trauma than veterans returning from the war in Afghanistan. Except unlike the veterans who are experiencing post-traumatic stress, the children are experiencing chronic stress because the trauma doesn't end. We can't expect schools to solve it on their own, not when we're faced with such a broad array of social and economic hardships, again, throughout the country. It's not an urban problem, it's a rural problem. It's a suburban problem because now we have the phenomena that you also know well here of the slumburbs. Right? Poor people being pushed out into communities that have no resources, that have no infrastructure, that have no transportation. And again, even though they have schools, They typically have schools that are under-resourced and unable to address this broad array of issues. There was a study done by UNICEF about 10 years ago, looked at the 25 richest countries. The United States came in 24th on child well-being. Everything from obesity rates to mental health, we are behind every other country except for the United Kingdom. And it's interesting because we always do these international comparisons to see how we're doing in the United States compared to countries in other parts of the world in math and science and reading, and we keep falling further and further behind. But no one ever asked the next question. Why? We're spending a lot of money on education. Why are we falling further behind? Well, actually, if you control for poverty, we're not doing so bad. Schools that are serving fewer poor children are actually doing very well. It's poverty that undermines our progress. And it's not just poverty, it's the lack of preschool, it's the lack of attention to the social and emotional needs of children. It's all the issues that accompany poverty in America that schools can't solve on their own. And the fact is that these problems are growing. It's always helpful when you talk about these issues to bring a Nobel Prize winning economist in to help you out. So let me quote Joe Stiglitz for a moment. He says, the United States has become the most unequal country among advanced industrialized countries. We have less opportunity than not only all of Europe, but any of the advanced industrial countries for which there's data. And what that means is very simple. The life chances of an individual are more dependent on the income and education of their parents than in other countries. And an implication of that is that people born into the bottom, who unfortunately choose the parents who are poor, he's joking, we don't choose our parents, will be more likely not to be able to live up to their potential. Now, although this is a recent quote, we knew this since 1966. Strongest predictor for how well a child does in school, for how well they'll do on the SAT or the ACT, is family income. Family income combined with how much education the parents had, particularly the mother. And what that means is that rather than our schools serving as the pathway to greater opportunity for many kids, what our schools do is to reproduce existing patterns of inequality. That's what the data shows. And again, all the policies we've adopted fail to address this because, to a large degree, we pretend that we can address this simply by raising standards and holding schools accountable. That's what we've been doing. And not surprisingly, because that's what we've been doing, what we've seen is the gaps widening considerably. They're widening in every category. They're widening so much that today, a high-achieving, low-income student is less likely to go to college and graduate than a low-achieving, affluent student. Money matters. I often say the only people who don't think money matters are people with lots of money. Right? Privilege matters. And so often what we are rewarding in schools is privilege, not effort, not ability, not innate talent, but who the parents were. I try to explain this to parents in New York who are trying to get their kids into gifted and talented programs. Try to explain the real gift their kids have is their parents. Right? And you know how you know that? My wife went to one of those gifted schools, Hunter School. You have to take a test at 4 to get in. Right? And every few years they get together, the alumni from the school, to share stories and commemorate the good old days back at Hunter. And occasionally she drags me along. And as I mingle and meet people, I say to her afterwards consistently, if they were really gifted, how come the gifts went away when they got older? How come they're mostly just ordinary people now? Right? Very few are really super talented people anymore. Their gift was they had a mom or a dad who taught them to read at 4. And they came to school way ahead of other kids. But now they're just a dentist or an accountant, you know. And that's great. But they're not even the best dentist or accountant. They're just pretty average dentists and accountants. I pointed out to her because at one time, they used to have affirmative action in some of those gifted and talented programs. Back when Lin-Manuel Miranda, some of you may know him, he's the one who directed and produced In the Heights, and now he's directed and produced and stars in Hamilton, top show on Broadway. Well, he graduated from Hunter. And he's also from Washington Heights. And I went to a performance that he did, and they had parents from Hunter come out and alumni come out. And I asked, Lynn, how come there are no longer kids from Washington Heights at Hunter? Or kids from Harlem? Or kids from East New York or the South Bronx? Did the gifts go away? We're not in the business of identifying potential from those places. We've closed off the opportunities. And that's an American issue, not a New York issue. And so what we've got to recognize is that these gaps in achievement, these gaps in opportunity are related to other gaps in our society. Gaps in wealth. We have gaps in income alone that are as great now in this country between African Americans and white Americans that are as great as in South Africa under apartheid in 1970. Should disturb us, should outrage us. You know, it's interesting, when Ferguson blew up, I was wondering about Ferguson. I'd never heard of Ferguson, this tiny little suburb outside of St. Louis. Then I looked it up, and Ferguson's not even one of the poorest communities in that area. The 10 poorest communities in the United States, 4 of them are black, 3 of them are Latino, the other 3 are white. Poverty in America is often rendered invisible until there's an incident like Ferguson, isn't it? And then we realize, oh, a whole lot of poor people shut out completely. That shutting out, that widening of the gaps in opportunity, again, is not just an educational phenomenon. We saw this during the mortgage crisis just recently, didn't we? Right. People losing their homes, but they didn't lose their homes everywhere. They lost their homes in certain places a lot more. Right. We're seeing it now around this lead crisis in the water. Certain places are experiencing contaminated water. Other places, not so much. Inequality affects life expectancy. How many of you saw the study recently that showed that low-income whites actually have a declining life expectancy right now? Shocking. Used to be the only ones that were experiencing that were African-American males, who actually saved the country money in terms of Social Security because the average life expectancy for an African-American male was under 65, which meant most couldn't live long enough to collect Social Security. Now it's happening to low-income whites too. And there's not a whole lot of explanation about why, much less what we should do. So these patterns of inequality, they cut across the whole system. They affect us in terms of wealth and income. They affect us in terms of health. They affect us in terms of education. The fastest growing population in the country, Latinos, have the lowest educational attainment rates. And you know who should really be concerned about this right now? About the fact that most Latinos still have less than high school diplomas? Old white people should be really concerned. Because old white people are the majority of our retirees. And increasingly, they will be dependent upon young brown and black people to provide for them, because it's the workers of today who support the retirees. That's how the system works. Except we don't see how interconnected we are. We're so divided as a country that instead of recognizing that we're in it together, we believe that educating other people's children should be their responsibility, not our collective responsibility. And so we talk about kicking undocumented people out of the country and kicking their kids out of school, even though we know that the whole economy is based on immigrant labor, and not just the legal kind. the undocumented kind too. Whole sectors of the economy couldn't function without undocumented labor. They'd realize that in Georgia, after they started deporting, that guess what? There'll be no more peaches to be picked because it's the undocumented who do that work. But those are the conversations that don't come up in the campaigns because we prefer to scapegoat, and we fail to recognize how interconnected we are. So what's important to recognize is the way in which what's happening in our schools is a mirror reflection of what's happening elsewhere in our society. We've just started to realize the suspension rates, for example. This idea that we're going to discipline kids by kicking them out of school and denying them learning times is actually reinforcing these gaps in achievement, because guess what? Kids aren't learning when they're not in school. And some of those kids who are not in school are actually unsupervised and getting into trouble. And so this school to prison pipeline that we've started to hear about is actually perpetuated by discipline strategies that push kids right out of school. And who are we most likely to punish? The kids with the greatest needs. And why do we punish them? Usually because of unmet needs. Sounds cruel when I put it like that, doesn't it? But I know from direct experience, because I was a school board member too. I always commiserate with school board members. You know, that's a tough job. It's a tough job because, first of all, it's not a stepping stone to higher office, you know. It's the last stop on the step, right? Because they know where you live and you're pissing people off all the time. When I was on the school board, we used to do expulsion cases too. We'd hear the cases, and the kids had always done something wrong. We didn't just pick up innocent kids for us to expel. They'd done terrible things sometimes. But who did we expel? Kids with learning disabilities, kids in group homes, kids who lived in homeless shelters, kids who had a whole set of other needs, but what we responded to was the behavior, not the unmet needs driving the behavior. So these gaps in discipline mirror the gaps in achievement. And not surprisingly, because there's these connections between graduation rates and college attendance rates and test scores and grades. You can't close these gaps by focusing on the outcomes alone. You have to also focus on the opportunities that influence the outcomes. But we don't get that, at least not in terms of policy. You know, if I try to, here's an analogy I would make for you. If you wanted to lose weight, would you go out and get the best scale possible? And weigh yourself as often as possible? Or would you try to think about it, getting some exercise and a better diet and change your lifestyle? Well, education, we've been focused on the scale, not on the work needed to prove the outcomes. And so, not surprisingly, scale hasn't changed. We don't even, when we look at Finland and all the results they're getting, or Canada, let's forget Finland because, you know, say that's socialist. Canada, what about Canada? Canada outperforms us on every indicator. Every indicator. And Canada, like Finland, like England, like Ireland, like Greece, poor, impoverished like Greece, has universal preschool. Wow. My colleague, Kathy McCartney, now the president at Smith, she studies preschool, and she described going to a conference in Europe where she was going to present her work, and she was there with some Italian researchers, and they were asking, what do you study? She said, well, I study the effectiveness of preschool. And they looked at her, and they said, she said, what? She said, that's a very American question, isn't it? I said, what do you mean? What are you studying? She said, we study how to get the best preschools for all kids. I said, oh. Different question, isn't it? Think about this. Montessori schools started in the ghettos of Rome for the poorest children, founded by Maria Montessori, a physician. But when imported to the United States, became almost exclusively available to affluent children. That's who it was started for. But the American version looks very different. Can't address the achievement gap if you don't address the preparation gap. The allocation gap What about that one? We're one of the few countries in the world that deliberately spends more money on the wealthy kids than on the poor. Consistently. There are some exceptions. DC is an exception. A few other districts are exceptions to that rule. But that's the American landscape in funding. And so these gaps keep getting perpetuated. And they show up in all kinds of places. Who gets access to highly qualified teachers, to lab science, to the learning opportunities that you need to be successful. I was visiting DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, school that once had over 6,000 students. James Baldwin graduated from DeWitt Clinton, Burt Lancaster, for you young people you won't know who that is. He used to be an actor. Generals, judges, all kinds of people. Today it has fewer than 2,000 kids. Has more homeless kids than any school in New York City, more formerly incarcerated youth than any school in New York City, and it is a school that everyone tries to avoid. Why? Because we stopped investing in it. Period. It doesn't offer life. What does it offer that would attract anyone? Nothing. And again, that's not a New York story, that's an American story. It's repeated over and over again in cities throughout the country, including Chicago. And so we get the schools we pay for or don't. But these simple facts somehow get obscured in the rhetoric about policy. So I'm going to read this one too. In the debate over how to fix American public education, many believe that schools alone can't overcome the impact that economic disadvantage has on a child. That life outcomes are fixed by poverty and family circumstances, and that education doesn't work until other problems are solved. This theory is in some ways comforting for educators. I hope you're feeling comforted by that theory. Problem is, the theory is wrong. It's hard to know how wrong, because we haven't yet tried to make the changes that would tell us. But plenty of evidence demonstrates that schools can make an enormous difference despite the challenges presented by poverty and family background. This was an op-ed, part of an op-ed, written by Joel Klein, the former chancellor of schools in New York City. But look at his co-authors. Janet Murguia from the National Council de la Raza, and Michael Lomax from the United Negro College Fund. He wanted to bring some allies with him on this. And that's the way they've been framing it. The problem is not poverty, the problem is not inequality, the problem is not unequal funding, the problem is lazy educators, failing schools. Schools can do this. And if you believe that, then you'll also believe that the state of Illinois could just take over Chicago, and because the governor actually knows better, doesn't he? Right? Because that's what we've been doing. We've been using threats and pressure as a strategy to improve schools. The state of Florida puts letter grades on schools. And you go to an A school all the way down to an F school. That was Jeb Bush's great innovation. Now I would think that if you put an F on the school and you still send children there, the state should be sued. Because you already said it was failing and you kept letting the kids go. So I visit Edison High School in Miami. It's a quadruple F school, 4 years in a row, failing school. I asked the principal, how do you get to be a failing school 4 years in a row? He says, we'll fail again. Because 85% of these kids don't speak English, haven't been in the country long enough. They can't pass an exam in English. I said, what happens if you fail again? He says, the state says they'll take us over. I say, are you worried about being taken over? He says, not at all, because I'm quitting at the end of this year. But you should know everyone I met described him as committed, hardworking, but he was tired. Tired of a system that beat people like him down. He said, the crazy thing is the state can't take us over because there are too many schools just like us. He said, what's more, do you think the state of Florida would know what to do if they took us over? Is there some secret recipe they've been holding back on? What's the record of state takeovers across the country? Ask the governor before he decides he wants to take it over. What's his plan? Right now, state of New Jersey, every urban district, with the exception of Elizabeth, is under state control. When's the last time you heard Governor Christie say that my schools aren't doing too well and accept responsibility for it? We have an accountability system that holds those with the most power the least accountable. It's top-down accountability. And we pretend that pressure and threats and humiliation will actually get schools to improve. No evidence that it works, but that's what we've been doing. So because this is so important, because I think there is another way to do this, part of what I think we have to do is shift the questions we're asking. And one of the questions I think we should be asking is, under what conditions are schools able to mitigate the effects of poverty, break the cycle of poverty, and exert a positive impact on the lives of kids? I was taken by the song we heard at the beginning, where the young lady said, an educated person is their nightmare. You know where that notion comes from? It comes from slavery. There's a reason why they made it illegal for slaves to learn to read and write, because they understood that an educated slave was dangerous. Well, if it was possible to educate people clandestinely under slavery, and it was, Frederick Douglass was an example of that, what's possible right now under these conditions that we live in? Well, there are schools that are showing us a lot is possible when we don't just focus on the academics, but when we also focus on health, when we focus on early childhood, when we work with parents, when we take a broader approach to how we educate kids. And there are a number of these schools now all across the country, what we call community schools, that have this broader focus. And the most famous is this one, led by Jeffrey Canada in New York City, Harlem Children's Zone. And they are serving over 6,000 kids in Central Harlem, and they provide everything from preschool to college support to parent education to violin lessons and dental work, the whole ball of wax. Now, a lot of people look at what Jeff Canada has done and say, well, guess what? That's not replicable, because Jeff has raised $175 million. He's got this pipeline to the hedge funds and Goldman Sachs and all these other major financial institutions that support his work. But the fact is that there are other communities that have been doing this for a while. Children's Aid Society has been doing it longer than Harlem Children's Zone, building these full-service schools. Right here in Chicago, Arnie Duncan, when he was superintendent, was doing work to expand the number of full-service schools. It makes sense, doesn't it? Hungry kids don't do well in school. And kids who don't have a stable place to live won't be able to get their homework done. The non-academic needs of kids influence their academic performance. And so unless we have this broader view and figure out ways to address it, then what we're going to find is the kids with the greatest needs continue to do least well. Not because they can't, but because they haven't had the needs met. There are also places that have figured out, you know what, part of what we've got to do is help kids to think about the future in very concrete ways, because kids who are grappling with survival may choose to leave school early. 40% of the kids who drop out of school right now, drop out of high school, drop out to work. That's what they do. They drop out to work to support themselves, to support their families, because they're choosing between school and work, and many kids already know, I'm not going to college, and I couldn't pay for it anyway. So they go to work. Well, there are a small number of schools that figured out, guess what? You don't have to make kids choose between school and work. You can do both. You can actually learn something at school that will lead to jobs that pay well. I helped to set up one. It's 25 years old now, the East Bay Biotech Academy. 7 schools, 7 high schools, 5 biotech firms. We started it because there was a failing alternative school in Berkeley, school that barely looked like a school because there were more kids out in the parking lot smoking than kids in classes. I was asked by the principal to come and help him. I get there, walking around the school, I don't know what to do. I talk to the teachers, say, what's it like to work here? They say, it's fine, no problem. We don't bother them, they don't bother us, everybody gets along. Go to the principal, I say, you got a problem here. Big problem. He said, I only got 2 problems. I said, what's that? He said, the teachers and the kids, that's it. I said, well, those are big ones, George. He said, well, I know how to deal with the teachers. I said, what are you going to do for the teachers? He said, I'm going to make them teach. He said, what I don't know how to do is to get the kids back into the classrooms. Can you help me with that? I said, I don't know if I could help, but I can do this. I'm a sociologist. I know how to talk to people. So I go out and talk to the kids. The first thing I learned is the kids at this school are all coming, even if they're not coming to class, despite the fact that they're old enough to quit if they want to. I also learned the overriding concern for these kids is survival. Because just say no didn't work for these kids, so some of them are surviving by selling drugs. And if we can't show them a way to earn a living legally, we're going to keep losing them. So I go back to George and said, that's what we got to do. We got to show these kids that with education they can actually improve their lives. Because some of these kids are raising kids of their own. Well, I had been working for the mayor of Berkeley at the time, and I knew that this biotech firm, Bayer Laboratory, was in negotiations with the city for a development agreement to expand operations. And I went around the negotiations and I went right to the CEO of the company and said, why don't you build a biotech academy at our school? And because it's a German firm, and because in Germany we use technical preparation as a way to get young people into technical fields, including biotech, he said this makes a whole lot more sense than anything the city's asked for. And we commenced to build this biotech academy. Required kids to take 4 years of science, 4 years of math, which was unheard of at this school because all we offered was remedial writing, remedial math, because we equated being low-skilled with being unintelligent. We say it's not simply good enough to raise the bar, we also have to get some incentives like jobs and internships and let the kids see how what they learn in school gets applied in the workplace. And so we set up paid internships and summer jobs. It's amazing what happens. You put these kids in goggles and white coats. Some of them start to think they're real scientists. It took us 4 years. 25 years later, that school is a national model for technical preparation. And guess what? You graduate with a degree in biotech, you don't have to work in biotech. You can go to medical school if you or be pre-med, undergrad. And we decided let's build a pathway into college. So we have community colleges and four-year schools that are part of it because we don't want kids stuck in dead-end jobs. They have other examples like this around the country. Examples that are showing us it's possible to engage kids differently. That rather than focusing on achievement, what we should focus in is getting kids excited about learning. That's what we should focus on. Think about the difference. When you get teachers focused on achievement, what do? They teach to the test. They narrow the curriculum. And what do? We get rid of anything not on the curriculum, not anything not on the test. Music's not on the test, get rid of music. Art's not on the test, cut that too. Recess is definitely not on the test. Why do we have recess? So I literally go to schools now across America where I see recess cut, PE cut, kids in double period literacy, double period math. I'm so glad I saw a study recently said that eating lunch was good for test scores. I said, thank God. They might take lunch too. But we only do that to poor kids. Middle-class kids are still getting art and music and recess. That narrow vision of what kids need is taking hold in our urban schools or in schools serving poor children, where there are some outliers. Schools that are focused on developing the curiosity of kids, schools that are doing project-based learning, schools that are getting kids to think about how what they learn in school can be applied in the real world. There are 36 such schools right now in New York City that do performance-based assessment, where it's not just about what you do on the test. They want to know, what can you do? What have you learned? Show us. Explain. My daughter went to a school like that, School of the Future, public school in New York City. 9th grade, she does her exhibition on The Roman and the Inca Empire, she has to explain how they rose, why they collapsed. She has to explain history and politics and economy and culture. End of the year, 25-page paper in 9th grade. And then she has to defend it. Defend it to teachers and students and parents. And only 3 grades are possible. Distinction for those who do the best, competence if you make the cutoff, or do-over. Failure not an option. And do-over means you're going to spend the summer, revise, resubmit. High standards made accessible. Here's a school with high standards. Hollenbeck Middle School in East LA. It's a 90-minute math class. Kids doing algebra. And they're up out of their seats. Look at them. Which means they're not just learning algebra. Because it means they're also learning how to work together, how to listen, how to problem solve. The social and emotional intelligence that we now say is so important, an attribute for success in life. And look at the teacher. She's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. If she wanted to, she could do yoga. Because she doesn't have to control the kids. They're in control of learning. And because the kids are in control of learning, she gets to move amongst the kids and see who needs help and who's on task and who's not on task. She's a master teacher. And these kids are poor, recent immigrants, English language learners, doing algebra in the 8th grade, 90 minutes. So engaged that when the bell rang, they were disturbed because they were immersed in the work. You know what this is? The highest form of classroom management. That's what it is. Because when kids are engaged like that, guess what? No disruption. They're too busy working. And there's noise in the room. Good, healthy, productive noise. It's not silence. It's not the cemetery method. You know the cemetery method? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. Method I see attempted in too many schools. And I always say, this teacher gets it. Learning's got to be fun. Especially in middle school, right? Because if learning's not fun, you know what happens? They're going to make it fun either way, at your expense if you're the teacher. Right? So she works with the energy. She doesn't try to control it. She doesn't try to keep them in their place. If you can do that in East LA, you can do that certainly in Evanston. You can do that anywhere in Chicago too. Youth Speaks. Youth Speaks, Sacramento area Youth Speaks. They did what this young lady did today. They used spoken word to develop literacy. Wow, it's amazing what happens when you give kids a chance to write and share about their lives. Kids who typically won't write in the classroom have so much to say. I was at Grant High School in a part of Sacramento called Del Paso Heights. It looks like rural Louisiana. Kids call it DPH, the deeper part of hell. That's what they call it. And I sat in on a literacy session when they were sharing their works, and the prompt was, I am not what you think I am. And the first girl shared said, I am not what you think I am not cancer. And she shared that 2 weeks ago she had been diagnosed with a tumor. And the next boy shared, he said, I am not what you think I am, not a homeless kid, just because my mother kicked me out of my house. And he shared this very traumatic incident where his mother and her boyfriend kicked him and his brother out of the house and took their clothes off their backs. And each incident was so traumatic, one after the other. But despite the trauma, the room felt like one big hug engulfing these kids, because the school understands that while they can't control what's happening outside, they can provide loving care and support within, even as they also develop their academic skills. It's not choosing one or the other. You're doing both. And so the kids are writing about their lives, but they're also now writing in science and in math too, because they get it. They get it that they can use education to change their lives, because they're not simply focused on the test scores. They're focused on much more. Here's a school in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Talk about poverty. I hadn't seen poverty like this anyplace. Not only were most of the people unemployed, living in shacks, over 50% of the kids orphans because their parents died of HIV. The principal in that picture, he's the guy at the back with the glasses, said when he got to the school was in shambles. Broken windows, couldn't get water into the building. People had robbed the school, vandalized the school, and he was assigned to the school to be the new principal. So the first thing he decides to do is to throw a party for the community. He calls it a Thanksgiving party. And he invites people, he has music and food, and people come, music and food. And they say, what are you thanking us for? He said, I'm thanking you for the support you will provide to the school. So they laugh too, they say, that's funny. He said, first thing I need is help putting a stop to the vandalism. Too many people ripping off the school, we got to stop it. They said, well, we know who's doing it. He said, well, I want to meet them. He said, these guys are unemployed, they're just trying to get by. So he said, let me meet these guys. Komtotsi in South Africa. So he goes and meets the guys, and he makes a deal. He said, I can't have you do this anymore. Why don't you provide security at my school? And I'll give you free housing at the school. You can live on site. We have all this land. And so now the guys who used to rob the school protect the school. And he goes to the moms, and he says, moms, kids are hungry, and we got all this land. Why don't we have a garden? And the mom said, well, good idea. He said, half the food you can keep, the other half of the kids. They said, great idea. So now every day, there are parents who don't get paid because there's no money to pay them, who work a garden, who clean the classrooms, who assist teachers, who do home visits to parents who are too sick to send their kids to school. And this was the Parent Leadership Council running the school, and Bruce kept telling me, I work for them. I work for them. It's their school. He said, I'll get sent someplace else. This school has to be here after they go. And now over 80 parents a day volunteer at the school, and what was once a school in shambles is a thriving school. Thriving school. And Bruce told me that recently they went to protest at the Ministry of Education because teachers hadn't been paid for 3 months. And parents led the protest. He said, I was marching with them. I said, in the United States, you wouldn't see principals marching in a protest for salaries. He said, listen, if I don't march with them, they'll be coming after me. So I'm going with them. But he gets it. He works for them, not for the ministry. What are we doing to engage parents in partnership with our schools? I always say, when you go into affluent communities and you ask the educators, who are you accountable to? You know what they tell you? To the parents. You know why? Because the parents, we keep reminding them, you work for us, not the board. Sorry, board members. Right? You work for us. But when you go into low-income schools and you ask the educators who you're accountable to, you rarely hear the parents, and it shows. Parents are a resource, just like the other parts of a community. And that's the reason why I and several others have been advocating what we call a broader and bolder approach to reform. So you can't just keep focusing narrowly on achievement, can't keep using pressure as a strategy. We gotta, at the minimum, look at the social and economic needs. We gotta expand learning opportunities for kids. We gotta bring services into schools, and we gotta shift the focus away from holding schools accountable to building capacity in schools. You know who's been doing that for a long time? The urban district in North America that's made the most progress has been doing capacity building. And you know what district that is? It's Toronto. And they've made more progress in educating poor kids and immigrant kids and kids of color than any other urban district in North America. And you know what's interesting about that? They did that under a crack-smoking mayor. Right? Wow. Imagine if they had a sober mayor, what they could have done. Right? Capacity building is different than what we've been doing. Capacity building means that when a school struggles, the folks from the district or the folks from the state come in and say, how can we help? What do you need? What do you need to work on together? We collaborate, we problem solve, we don't blame and scrutinize and pressure and threaten. Different approach. And it works. It works, but the problem is there's not a single state in this country where the State Department of Education is organized around capacity building. You know what they're organized around? Compliance. how to hold schools accountable to their policies. We need a different approach. We need a different vision. It's got to be more holistic than what we've been seeing. It's got to address the academic needs of kids, but it's also got to address health and safety and nutrition. It's got to engage families and community, because schools can't do it all by themselves, especially not in poor communities. And when that vision comes together, great things are possible. This is a big school. This school's bigger. Brockton High School, 4,200 kids. One of 2 urban high schools in the state of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is the top performing state in the country, that gets a level 1 rating. Right? Gets a level 1 rating because over 90% of the kids at that school get the highest possible, get past the state exam. Over 1/3 of the senior class for the last 5 years in a row gets the highest possible score. Back in 1998, when the state announced it was going to implement their high-stakes exams, and you don't pass the exam, you don't get a diploma, a group of veteran teachers at Brockton High School went to the principal, Sue Satchel, and said, "Sue, the only way our kids can pass this exam is if every teacher becomes a teacher of literacy." Because the kids are coming into high school reading at 3rd and 4th grade level. And test prep won't do it. And so Sue says, "Great idea, but I can't make the teachers do it." I said, "No problem, we'll work with the willing. We'll work with those who are willing to do it. We don't have to wait." I said, "But I can't pay you." She said, "We'll work on our own time." And even though this is a heavily unionized district in a heavily unionized state, they worked on their own time, training those who are willing. 2002, the exams given, 50% of the kids pass, which was a victory because they expected 75% to fail. So they stuck with literacy. By 2006, it was 80%. Since 2010, over 90%. Now, the thing about Brockton is if you Google it, you'll see they had a fight at their graduation. Big brawl, because they're known as the fighters. They got a boxing statue out front from Rocky Marciano. That's where he's from. It's a working class community. But the demographics of the school match the demographics of the kids getting the highest possible score. And all those kids get a free scholarship now to any public university in the state. Brockton is a school where your background does not predict how well you will do. If you could do that in Brockton, I think you could do that lots of places. Here's another place doing it. PS 28. In New York City, we have very creative names for our schools. Public School number 28. Bedford-Stuyvesant. Sadie Silver, the principal, featured in the Daily News because of the high scores at her school. She's calling me, "Pedro, come visit, come visit." Finally, I get out there. She introduced me to her secretary. She said, "I want you to meet the person who does all the administrative work." She's a super secretary. I said, "Well, then what do you do?" She said, "I'm the lead teacher. I become a principal to escape the classroom." I said, "Come on, let's go visit some classrooms." We go into classrooms, and I notice every classroom is 4 and 5 adults. I'm saying, "Where do you get all these teachers from?" She said, "They're not all teachers. Most of these are parents we've trained to work with teachers." I said, "They work with teachers?" I said, "You pay them?" She said, "I have no money to pay them. They're volunteers." And one of them's making copies, another one's handing out books. One parent is just standing next to a little boy. I said, "Why is she so close to that boy?" She said, "Well, she's there to keep him calm. We're glad she's here. He has trouble sitting still." She explained the school works through a series of partnerships, a partnership with a hospital that provides health services at the school, a partnership with the YMCA that provides after-school programs, swimming lessons on Thursdays, art, music. Here's another partnership with the job training agency, provides GED classes and job training for parents who want it because she believes if parents are educated and employed, they will do a better job with the kids. She takes me to, she says, "Let me show you the professional development I have going on for my teachers today." And there are 2 social workers with 8 teachers, and the teachers are posing questions about issues with the kids. One teacher says, "I got a kid who's aggressive, he's a fighter, he's biting other people. What do I do?" Another teacher said, "I got a child who's depressed." Another one said, "I got a child with anxiety disorder." One teacher says, "I got a child with attachment issues. He's attached to my leg and I can't teach." And in each case, the social workers are giving practical suggestions. Try this, come back tomorrow, let me know how it worked. And I turned to Sadie and I said, what made you offer this as a form of professional development for your teachers? She said, my teachers have to be more skilled to work at this school. And until I did this, they were referring too many of our kids to special education. I had to put a stop to it. So let me introduce my guidance counselor. So we walked down the hall to meet the counselor. She said, I got to warn you, I got him from the rubber room. Okay, and those of you who don't know, New York City has this place, still has this place called the rubber room, where teachers who have been written up for some infraction get sent. And they could be there sometime for years, collecting salaries and not allowed to go to a school and work with kids. So I say, well, how do you know to get this man from the rubber room? She said, I don't know why he was there in the first place, but he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school. So I asked for him, because he saved my life as a child. And they said, you could have him. So I go into the room and I introduce myself to the counselor and to the young man who's with him, a boy about 7 or 8 years old. I asked the boy, why are you here today? He says, I'm here to learn how to be good. So I said, is it working? He said, I hope so. I'm tired of being sent out of class. And then they explained the school has a no suspension policy, because they don't believe sending kids home to watch television is an effective form of discipline. So they really do focus on character and impulse control and the social behavior that's so essential. So we're leaving there, and I tell her, I'm going to write to Joel Klein, the same Joel Klein I mentioned. He was the chancellor of schools at the time in New York City. I said, I'm going to tell him what I saw at your school. She said, well, if you're going to talk to the chancellor, I got to show you one more thing. Come to my office. We go to our office, and there's a table with chairs, big round table. I said, what happens here? She said, I told you I'm the lead teacher. I'm working with kids all day that teachers struggle with. She said, but I want to show you this. And she shows me her data system, because every child at the school has a learning plan. Every child. They know exactly where they are. They know they have copies of their work in portfolios, because they're monitoring their performance. Nothing is left to chance. It's all very deliberate and very focused. So now I'm even more impressed. So I write to Joel Klein. I tell Joel, you need to go visit PS 28. 3 days later, he shows up. And he's impressed too. So he writes about it and sends it out in a memo to every principal in New York City. 1,800 principals. So the only thing he mentions is the data system. Because New York City just spent $100 million in that data system. And he was happy to see somebody using it. So I write to him, I said, Joel, I'm so glad you visited, but you missed it. Because it's not just the data system that makes a school like that work. It's all those things that come together. That's the problem. The people in charge don't understand what the work is. The further removed they are from the schools, the less they know, typically. Typically because in America, those who have the most knowledge about education have the least say. And those who know the least have the most say. And not surprisingly, many basic things like literacy, what a gimmick they came up with in Brockton. Teaching kids to read and write. Wow! Who ever heard of such a gimmick before? No, instead we want to focus on iPads. Right? That was John Dacey's brilliant idea. $1 billion on iPads for LA schools. $1 billion in money they didn't even have. And they didn't even make sure that the teachers knew how to work. The kids knew more about the iPads than the teachers. So kids who already figured out how to get on Facebook in class, and now the iPad's a big problem. Because we keep looking for gimmicks instead of looking at what really works. As I said earlier, we are faced with huge problems related to the changes in our country, related to growing inequality, related to demographic change. And regardless of what Donald Trump says, immigration is changing America. Still, it always has. And we should be glad, that immigrants actually want to come. It'd be a bad sign if nobody wanted to come here anymore. Question is, what kind of society are we going to become? And what role will education play in creating a more just and equitable society? I believe there are ways to change the course, to use schools as a resource for progressive change. I think we need different policies, though, than we pursue. And I hope here in Evanston they support, because this is a community I know values education, believes in its children, is willing to tax itself to support its schools, so you can be a leader for the whole country on what's possible. I wish you the best in that journey. Thank you.